be 50% sometime. Most of the field offices, I'm going to guess, are probably around the 60 to 80% in the office there, which when I say in the office means they come in, maybe they grab a vehicle, they go out and do some inspections or inventory type things, etc. So it really is kind of varying.
Yeah.
And for right now, just to fill the airtime there, is that so anybody who self-identifies as high risk doesn't come in the office. So that's got some parameters defined on it, but
it's a YouTube.
Yeah. Now, what about visitors that come to the office? What requirements do you have for them?
So here in the state office, we're in a multi-tenant building, so that changes things a little bit. So what we've done with our public room, which is usually pretty active, is we were having to limit the number of people per table and things like that there. So they're calling in by appointment. If they want to come in, they make an appointment to make sure we have enough tables and things like that for them to sit 6 feet apart and do all of that. A lot of the field offices are the front door in most of them is open. People can walk in, grab brochures, etc. A few restrictions here and there if something local pops up, but for the most part, tried to open up that front foyer to come in. So really was really big this year in that, we're hitting our very busy time of year with the hunters stopping in. So
right.
So that was important to get that going.
Do you have mask requirements for visitors?
Well, gosh, I'm kind of dancing around on how to answer that here. Is that here in the state office, we do have a mask requirement because we're in the multi-tenant building down in the common area. We've asked them to put in. As far as the employees go, there is not a mask requirement.
Can you log on to Zoom, Eric?
Yeah, I can log. Yeah, I can.
Okay. Okay. Join the board on Zoom. I got to get back to that, and I don't. I'll have to see if Mary can look into where we are on YouTube. I got to help get this meeting going.
I'll join the board just like I did yesterday on Zoom. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Bye.
Well, thanks for the summary, Duane.
You bet.
See if Mary can look into where we are on YouTube. I got to help get this meeting going.
I'll join the board just like I did yesterday on Zoom. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Mary.
Well, thanks for the summary, Duane.
You bet.
See if Mary can look into where we are on YouTube. I got to help get this meeting going.
I'll join the board just like I did yesterday on Zoom.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, we have an echo effect. As you can hear, Mary.
Well, thanks for the summary, Duane.
Mary, are we on Zoom? Everybody have to mute themselves except the speaker. Mary,
thanks for the summary, Duane.
Everybody have to mute themselves except the speaker. Mary,
All right. Is everybody getting muted out there? Hey.
George, can you mute everybody
out there?
Sorry about that. I think we're good there. This is our first time.
Out there?
Sorry about that.
everybody at once?
We'll learn.
George, can you hear me? It's Duane.
Our first time. Sorry. We'll learn.
George, is this
George,
feedback?
can you hear me? It's Duane.
You wanna off to YouTube?
Sorry.
George, is this
George,
feedback?
can you hear me? It's Duane.
You wanna off to YouTube? George, is this
George,
feedback?
can you hear me? Hey, George, Duane here. Can you hear me?
Okay, I've muted everyone
Hey, George, Duane here. Can you hear me?
except for Duane. So sorry about that, folks. This is our first time. And there is obviously, as you can hear, a delay between Zoom and
George, Duane here. Can you hear me?
and I hope we'll survive this. So sorry about that, folks. Well, something's not being muted. Let me make sure it's not me. Maybe it is. There. I think I've stopped myself. Okay. So this is how we'll work it. I've asked Mary Troutner to monitor YouTube. We announced on our social media today that we are simulcasting this meeting on YouTube. And people can type in questions, comments, and she will help relay them to our speakers when we get to that point in our meeting. And to introduce our speakers today, we have our PLF Wyoming State Representative, Bill LeBaron. But before we do that, Ed, did you have any opening remarks that you wanted to make today? Or go ahead, unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to welcome Duane and the folks from Wyoming, and I wish we were there in person. I wanted to go on a field trip out there and see some of that country again, but we appreciate the work that of planning that our Wyoming folks and Duane's Wyoming folks did and regret that we can't be there in person, but this is the next best thing, I guess. So with that, Bill, I'll just turn it over to you so you can introduce Duane and the other speakers.
Hey, Bill, unmute yourself.
Bill, you there?
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Gotcha, Bill.
Oh, good. Yeah, before I get started here, I mentioned one thing about Wyoming and the PLF meetings. 11 years ago on 9/11, the meeting was planned for Wyoming for the PLF meeting, and it had to be canceled because of the damage done there in New York. And then the next time we come around, we were lucky. We did okay. We had the tour. This year, we got the coronavirus. So I know there are a lot of people who are going to help put this thing on. And one of the things is we had the support of the field manager in Rock Springs, along with the state director. And I've invited Kimberly Foster to sit in on our meeting here today. So I just wanted to mention that she was going to be a big support for us doing the field trips. So we're going to get started. And the first we're going to have is Duane Spencer. He is the acting state director for Wyoming. He's been in that position since August, was it? August 19th or 2019.
Yep.
And he manages about 18 million acres of public lands, along with 40 million acres of federal mineral estate. And he began his career in Rawlins, Wyoming. And PLF got to know him pretty well because he was the manager at Buffalo office, and we got to get to know him pretty well when he was there, the people in PLF. So anyway, I'd like to introduce Duane Spencer.
All right. Well, thank you, Bill. Hey, one little technical note. I got a text from Angi Bruce and Bob Budd that they're not able to get logged in on Zoom, George. So don't know if you can shoot them a new update or anything like that. So thought I'd share that real quick. So is the audio coming through all right?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right.
Yeah, good.
All right. Well, thanks. Welcome, everybody. It is really a pleasure to give some opening remarks about BLM Wyoming. And really, we are disappointed that we aren't able to get together face-to-face due to the COVID-19. And for those of you who didn't hear a little bit of the opening chatter that we were having, I can say here that as a little bit of background is my dad did work for BLM. So as I can say, the first time I went to a BLM office, I was 6 months old. So that's, I don't know if anybody else has got almost, it's approaching 59 years here, but anyway, I'm going to throw that out there here. And I was telling Ned earlier that I probably was derelict and should have gone over to my folks' house and got them hooked up on Zoom here and let them hear the less than live in-person presentation here, but it's easier without your dad listening and giving you the critique afterwards here. So, as we look back on 2020, unfortunately, the pandemic will be kind of at the epicenter of everything that's happened this year. It's been really a challenging time for us, but I am really proud and everybody in our state's really proud on the things we've been able to really get done this year in spite of COVID and the pandemic. As a little bit of background, Bill mentioned here for BLM Wyoming, there are 18 million acres of public lands. And then we also manage almost 43 million acres of federal mineral estate. And for those of you familiar with Wyoming, definitely the energy and the wildlife, we've got some world-class resources that we deal with here in the state. So along that same lines, from a historical perspective, we manage 698 miles of congressionally designated national scenic and historic trails, plus hundreds of miles of other popular and significant trails in Wyoming. One of the really neat things we have is the National Historic Trails Interpretive Center in Casper, which offers 7 permanent galleries, weekly interpretive programs, and trail trek tours of historic trails, all free to the public. As you can imagine, this year, those programs have been really impacted there, unfortunately, which is sad because we get a lot of people coming through that are interested in that tourism aspect of the National Historic Trails. Being a good neighbor to our communities is really a top priority for BLM, as all of you know there, and particularly we focus it in on it here in Wyoming because we have such a low population here, is that you have a lot of interaction with people there. You can't just immerse yourself in a big city and disappear there. So really we focus in a lot on that and really focus in a lot on our economic contributions to the state related to, oil and gas and uranium, trona, bentonite, and other mineral development, as well as recreation and a lot of our trail uses here. When you're from Wyoming, you got to always throw in there how many royalties are generated, et cetera. And we had approximately $1.4 billion of economic activity generated last year, which is really half of which is generated or distributed to the state there. And so that is a big part of our program. You know, a lot of you have a grazing background, so a little more info statistics here is that we administer 2,900 grazing permits and leases covering approximately 17.4 million acres and offered approximately 3.3 million board feet of timber in sales. One of the really interesting things that we have here is that we do support the nation's longest mule deer migration corridor, known as the Red Desert to Hoback Migration Corridor, as well as over 40% of the greater sage-grouse habitat. And I know hopefully we'll be able to get Angi Bruce and Bob Budd on so they can do more discussion about the corridors and sage-grouse. So I'll try not to go over that too much. Recreation is an active, thriving program within our state there, and we estimate we had 2.5 million visitors to public lands. And that we have also the challenges associated with managing wild horses here. Our population is at just over 8,700. And I gotta say, I don't remember what the AML number is, but I know we are, I will say, substantially over that. We manage 16 herd management areas. We have 3 and soon to be 4 holding facilities, 1 preparation facility in Rock Springs, the Mantle Adoption and Training Facility in Wheatland, and the Wyoming Honor Farm in Riverton with a total wild horse holding capacity of 1,200. So those are a few highlights that we thought you'd be interested in. And so I'd like to go over a couple of what we thought were big accomplishments this year. First of all, we're very close to issuing a recorded decision on the Converse County Oil and Gas Project, which analyzes up to 5,000 new oil and gas wells on 1,500 well pads in Converse County, Wyoming. The project area encompasses approximately 1.5 million acres of split estate mixed surface ownership lands. The operators propose to develop the wells over 10 years with the life of the project anticipated to be 20 to 30 years. Secondly, we were very proud to have completed the Moneta Divide Natural Gas and Oil and Gas Development Project Environmental Impact Statement and issued a recorded decision which analyzed up to 4,250 natural gas and oil wells and associated infrastructure within the proposed Moneta Divide project area. The project is located predominantly in Fremont and Natrona counties and encompasses approximately 265,000 acres of land, and it's another estimated 40-year project. Another big, I'm just going over the high-level EIS projects here. Another one we're working on with the state of Wyoming is the Wyoming Pipeline Corridor Initiative, which we have planned to complete by the end of the year. It was a project from the state of Wyoming to designate approximately 2,000 miles of pipeline corridors across private, state, and BLM managed lands in Wyoming. And the purpose of it was to provide for future development of pipelines associated with carbon capture, utilization, and storage, as well as pipeline and facilities associated with enhanced oil recovery. One big topic we were going to cover at the in-person meeting was the Rock Springs Resource Management Plan revision and the Rock Springs Wild Horse Management Resource Management Plan amendment. And so what I thought here is I would have Kimberly Foster come in and provide you some update about those 2 projects. So Kimberly?
Good morning. So first of all, thank you for having me and letting me crash your meeting today. I'm so sorry that you guys didn't get to make it to Rock Springs. The field trip we were planning was to see the Red Desert to Hoback Migration Corridor. We were going to take you on some of it, show you some of the Red Desert areas. So you'll have to make a trip back to be able to see that. We'd be happy to take you anytime. So as Duane mentioned, I'll give an update kind of on where we're at. As you know, we started, or you may not know, but we started the Rock Springs RMP revision in 2011. So it's been a long road. That project has had a lot of stops and starts for a variety of reasons, including the wild horse consent decree that we entered into as an agency in 2013 with the Rock Springs Grazing Association. That, as you know, we have checkerboard land here in Rock Springs, quite a bit of it. And there a historic agreement with Rock Springs Grazing had allowed wild horses to be present on their private land in the checkerboard. And so those herd management areas were designed with that in mind. The population of those is designed with the private land in mind. And in 2013, they withdrew their consent through a series of lawsuits that had occurred prior to that. And we entered into an agreement to relook at management, particularly in the checkerboard for wild horses. We eventually pulled that wild horse document out of the Rock Springs revision due to the delays that we had, mainly for greater sage-grouse in both 2015 and again in 2019. And then of course we had some change in administration priorities for the Rock Springs RMP. So all of that led us to pull out the wild horse EIS. So I'll cover that first and then we'll get back to the revision. So in January of 2020, we released the draft environmental impact statement for the wild horse management in the Rock Springs and Rawlins field offices, everything in the checkerboard. That was part of the Rock Springs Grazing Association consent. We released that at the very end of January. The comment period was open through the end of April. And as you can imagine, we got a lot of public comment. It took us longer to go through the public comments than we had hoped, but we understand that this is going to be heavily litigated. We've been litigated throughout the entire time we've tried to implement the consent decree, starting in 2014 when we did our first gather. Don Simpson was still state director at that time. I'm sure he recalls that fondly. But we were litigated again in 2015. We were litigated again in 2017, and then again in 2018. So the consent decree and the checkerboard lands has been highly controversial. The wild horse amendment that we're working on will change the management into the future and basically remove all checkerboard land from those herd management areas. And then we have a variety of alternatives that we looked at for how to manage horses into the future outside of the checkerboard. And like I said, we published the draft in January. Some of the public wasn't happy about it. And so we received close to 5,000 comments on that. We've been going through those. We have the final EIS just about ready to publish. So we're putting the final touches on that with our solicitor's office. And our plan is to release the final EIS very soon in the fall. And then it'll be followed by the record of decision after that. And like I said, we had pulled those wild horse decisions out of the Rock Springs ongoing revision for the land use plan, mainly for a timing perspective, because we need to get under the court order that we had for the 2013 consent decree with Rock Springs Grazing. We had some timelines that we had to meet. So we've pulled that out and we're doing that separately. In the meantime, we've been working on the RMP revision as a whole that covers the 3.5 million acres of surface land and 3.6 million acres of subsurface that we manage here out of Rock Springs. If you're not familiar with the Rock Springs office, we have a variety of we have oil and gas, we have coal mining, we have trona mining. We actually manage all of the trona mining out of Rock Springs, even except for the surface lands in Kemmer, but all of our engineering is done out of Rock Springs. We also have the first solar farm that was approved on BLM public land in Wyoming, is in the Rock Springs office and was constructed in 2019. So we have a variety of challenges from a management perspective, particularly as we look at the checkerboard. We also have hundreds of miles of National Historic Trail, along with some recreation activities and things. So trying to find that balance has been challenging as we've worked through the RMP revision with our cooperating agencies and with the public. We're getting close. We had a draft EIS about a year ago. And then as we were kind of going through the final stages of that, we decided that we needed to update the alternatives and kind of expand out the alternatives a little bit. They were a little bit conservative and didn't necessarily meet all of the priorities of this administration. And so we expanded those out. We've redone those. We've completed the analysis. That draft EIS was shared with our cooperating agencies earlier this year. And we're working kind of through the final stages of getting that approved. Obviously, the wild horse EIS was a priority for us. And so that kind of took front stage while we worked on this Rock Springs revision. But both of them are close now. The final EIS for the wild horses. And then of course the draft EIS is just about ready to publish. We're kind of caught up right now in some policy stuff on land tenure. In our Rock Springs RMP, we have about 48,000 acres of land identified for disposal, as most RMPs do. And so that's causing some concern. And so we're waiting on some policy guidance for that to see if we need to adjust that before that draft goes public. But we're getting very close. So hopefully, I'm hoping that we get to release that draft in the next couple of months, because I think there's a lot of speculation. This draft has been going on for a number of years. There's a lot of concern about the sublet migration corridor that I'm sure Angi and them are going to cover. It's also, that's another name for the Red Desert to Holbeck, and how we're managing that in the Rock Springs RMP. There's a lot of consternation about the Little Mountain area, which is kind of in the south central portion of our field office, kind of off 191 if you're familiar with the area. And so unfortunately, there's a lot of rumors and speculation about what's actually in the plan. And although our cooperators know and they've seen the plan and they helped us develop the alternatives, there's still a lot of unfortunate rumors out there. So it'll be great to get the draft out in the public's hands and let them see it for the first time and actually make comments on what we've actually proposed and what we actually analyzed versus all the speculation. So we are anxiously awaiting getting that published. I think that's a long time coming, and we're ready. And I think the public will be pleased in the end, and they'll be able to look at the analysis and see what we've done. So I think that'll be a good effort for that. So hopefully we're going to see some serious efforts here in the next couple months and get some of these projects, these planning projects that we've been working on for a number of years out the door. I've been field manager for 6.5 years here in Rock Springs, and kind of both of these were underway when I got here. So it'll be really nice to kind of get those out the door and into the public's hands again. I think that's it, Duane, for updates.
Okay, thanks, Kimberly. So, we continue to work on a lot of our normal workloads related to all the standard program areas, from grazing, realty program, oil and gas, etc. I thought I would also mention there is we've gained a lot of experience with the Secretarial Order 3355, which really outlined the 1-year EIS timeframe, environmental impact statement timeframe. And so one thing that we've really learned some good lessons, and Kimberly's been really helpful on, is that before you kick off these processes, you really have to have a lot of the pre-work done. And you need to go in with a definitely end goal in mind on what you want to achieve, because when you're on a 1-year timeframe, you don't have a lot of time to sit there and do reanalysis or come up with different alternatives or get to the review team and say, hey, did you consider this there? So that's been something we've been working on and learning lessons from Kimberly's experience with her 2 EISs that she said have been going on for over 6 years, trying to get them done by these timeframes. So shifting gears real quick. I had a few questions when we first started there about what's been going on with respect to COVID. So a couple things that I thought I would fill out there is that number one, Wyoming had a small population. So in some respects that gave us an advantage, is that you didn't end up with the big population centers that had a lot of infection explosion or hot spots. So what we've been doing as a department, and definitely within BLM, for those of you who heard me before, it'll be repetitive, is that the department put together kind of what I'll call a 4-step process. The first one means you're behind the gate, that you've got enough where you've got to have maximum telework, meaning limited number of people in the office, everybody teleworking whether they want to or not. Then you enter in through gate 1, the first gate. And so within Wyoming, one of the differences that we had compared to some of the BLM states was the governor of Wyoming did not issue a stay-at-home order. So fairly early on, we were into what is phase 1. And phase 1 is people are allowed in the office. It's limited, but it's more telework flexibility, but it's not mandatory where you're out of the office and only limited people coming in. And so that's been a lot different with our variety of BLM states. For example, California, I think they've been behind the gate and it's been on maximum telework, not allowed in the office, not allowed out of your house since about March. and it really varies by state, with a lot of our more remote offices being able to go in where people are allowed in the office. You can go out in the field. We still have some trying to control the social distancing, letting people in and out, but trying to keep that people are allowed in the office. Ultimately, with the goal of what they call gate 3 is that you're back to what I'll call business as normal, that there are not restrictions. People can come in the office, et cetera, that you don't need to worry about. I'd say never worry about social distancing. I don't know how we'll break that habit, et cetera. And so we're still in our phase 2 here in Wyoming. And so a lot of our public rooms are open out in the field offices. Here in the state office, we're in a multi-tenant building. So we've all got together and we've agreed there that how people will get into the building, because we have a different level of security. We are limiting the number of people who are allowed in the public room to keep them apart there. So we're operating our public room here in the state office by appointment only. Most of our field offices have not had to do any limitations that way, because they maybe get the ebb and flow of people stopping in to get brochures or get information there. So they've not had to worry about big crowds. So our goal hopefully is that we hope we can move into phase 3 where we return to normal operations. But really, we're all very much tied in with the state public health orders, every state. So you have it really varies depending which state you're in with BLM. And a couple other things to share is, finally, before I open it up to any questions, I would like to let you know that Wyoming does have a new permanent associate state director, Kim Liebhauser. Kim joined us from our Wind River Bighorn Basin district, where she was the district manager, and she offers a lot of experience. She's bringing, and it says 30 plus years, so we'll just round off here. She's sitting in here with me there, and so maybe I should turn my camera so you can all see her. No, she doesn't want on the camera, darn it here, but we're glad to welcome Kim. She's here on her 3rd week. As far as the state director position goes, they're still working on it. And so it's been 13 months now, and they're still working on it. So hopefully some things are in progress on it. And with that, I will cut off and we'll open it up to if anybody has any questions, Bill or George or whoever was running the meeting.
Okay, before.
How do we run this?
I am going to try and help the next speakers get on. Now.
Okay. I got a text from Angi that said they were able to get on. So hopefully you show them. Let me see.
They are on. All right. Well,
Angie's on.
Then we don't have a
Yep.
problem then. Good. Okay. Then we'll open it up. Everybody can unmute themselves and ask Duane any or Kim any questions you may have.
Right. Except maybe, I don't know if Mary Jo and Don Simpson get to ask or not there, since they were former state directors. Yeah.
Hey, George, Don Simpson, can I ask a question?
Well, can't hear you, Don. You need to mute. No, just kidding. I'm just kidding with you, Don.
Yeah, you wanted me to mute up, didn't you, really badly? So,
Yeah.
Hey, thank Kimberly and Duane. Great presentation. I just had a question. I've been kind of reading a little bit about a proposal that I don't know if the legislature is responsible, the governor or both, about some massive land acquisition potential in the checkerboard.
Yeah. And so they had proposed Occidental Resource, or the old Anadarko, who has gone through a myriad of names, was acquired by Occidental oil and gas company there, and they decided to divest their checkerboard holdings, and the state of Wyoming submitted a bid on it, and their bid was not accepted. So a privately owned mineral company, and their name just dropped off of, I just forgot their name. Their bid was accepted, so the state was not able to acquire that. And so one of the big things, I talk too much here, but one of the big things going on there that has been very interesting in today's is that there's going to be an expansion within the Trona leasing area for the first time ever last year, not first time ever, but first time in many, many decades. We had a Trona competitive sale there and we did it. And so we've got a new company that is preparing a project that is south in the Trona area that will be through solution mining, not through the typical mechanical mining where they've got big underground works, et cetera. And so that process is still, that project is really early on, but we're talking about a large scale, a new plant to do it there. We're talking about a railroad spur that will have to be built down from the Union Pacific Railroad. And it's also located, part of the project is in Sage-grouse core area. So it's got all sorts of little or big interesting issues associated as it moves forward. What else, Don?
So one more question then, if nobody else is going to jump in. You had probably one of the biggest landscape conservation initiatives going in the country, along with New Mexico and 3 or 4 others. What's the current status of all of those landscape conservation initiatives? Are they somewhat falling apart, holding their own, or in a different status?
Well, I'll give you my perspective there, and then maybe Kimberly can weigh in. So the project, the initiative is still ongoing. Where a little bit of the struggle has been is that the dedicated funding stream disappeared. So in order to fund projects now, they're back in competing with all the other resource projects that we have. And so that's been a real evolution for that group to go through, because BLM had a nice dedicated revenue stream that we could allocate to a variety of projects. And I'm not saying other partners didn't kick in, but BLM provided the bulk of the real dollars for hiring contractors, et cetera. And so we still, after a year, are still working through a lot of that funding mechanism to get some of the other partners to more actively contribute funds to some of the projects. So still got that group going. We still sit down and go through the yearly prioritization, et cetera, but it has been a big change to have those projects come in to compete with other projects that come out of those field offices versus having the dedicated funding stream. So Kimberly, do you have some things to add on that?
Well, I'll just add that has been a struggle, the funding mechanisms. Credit to our Wyoming Landscape Conservation Initiative folks, the BLM folks, and then all the other agencies, that the Fish and Wildlife and the state folks that are involved. They've been trying to get additional funding sources, even through they've partnered now with some other agencies and different foundations, and they're just looking at grant sources and that kind of thing, because I think everybody supports the concept and understands the value in doing stuff on a landscape level scale. It's just trying to get all those funding pieces to come in place. And like Duane said, the BLM no longer has a specific dedicated funding source for that. So they're just in competition. So, it's just a much harder sell when every field office is competing for funds for individual projects within the field office, and then also to compete against a landscape level project with other agencies and other BLM offices, even for that matter. So it has been a challenge. Credit to the folks that are trying really hard to find some funding mechanisms. Hopefully I think the effort is still there. It's just a shame that they're not seeing the level of projects that they've seen in the past.
It's just going to take us a little more planning to get the dollars. The Wyoming State Legislature did do some, I think Bob Budd's on. Bob could probably talk about it if he has a little time after Sage-grouse here, but it definitely, they provided some matching funds so that we had some opportunities. But yeah, we're just going to have to think a little bit more about how we get the projects funded, because I hate to say, never say easy when you had the dedicated funding stream that went to that, but now you're mixed in with the pot of looking at 7 or 8 different sage-grouse or weed treatment projects, et cetera. And so having to build that case where we have matching partners and everything, it just takes more work.
I had a question on that. Is there any possibility that the full funding of the Land and Water Conservation Fund provides some funds for the state to match or for BLM to apply for?
That's a good question. I don't know yet that it's come up that way versus acquisitions and other things there, but we'll be looking at that as they roll out how they want to use those funds. A lot of what we're seeing on that full funding is for the deferred maintenance backlog that I'm sure all of you had that deferred maintenance back when you were working there with all of that there. And so we're seeing within BLM a significant infusion of dollars to take care of that deferred maintenance. And one of the challenges we're facing is, you've got a substantial gear up for everybody to get those projects done because a lot of them are construction oriented. And so we definitely are going to need some more civil engineers that you're going to have to, some civil engineering techs. You're going to have a little more contracting. You've got to have those contractor reps that are out, project inspectors and all there. So that's been the main focus so far, but under the Great American Outdoor Act, there are probably a few other opportunities that they've not come up yet, but we're going to be looking at them.
Yeah, I know that about half of that Land and Water Conservation Fund is designated to the states to be able to get funding, and
Okay.
Some of the other parties might go instead of for the maintenance.
Yeah, good question. Thank you.
Hey, Kimberly, this is Ray Brady. Appreciated the update on the Rock Springs planning effort. Congratulations also on the first solar project in Wyoming on BLM public lands. For the Rock Springs planning effort, are you including the identification of some additional solar development zones as part of the planning effort?
So as far as like a solar leasing program, no. Wyoming was not part of the 6 states that did the solar leasing several years ago now. And so we didn't look at a solar leasing program in the Rock Springs RMP. So we looked at it from a right-of-way perspective because that's how we authorize it. So we do have a solar section in the RMP, and we did identify where rights-of-way would be allowed or avoided or restricted in any way, that kind of thing. So it's really looked at more from the right-of-way perspective as opposed to any type of solar leasing. My understanding is BLM is now looking at possibly doing a full solar leasing effort across the nation. And so Wyoming would be part of that. Should that occur, and that would actually amend any new plan that we have, because that would implement a solar leasing program in a way that we didn't even look at.
Right.
So one thing I'll add that for Kimberly here is that, like all of you know, when you worked on a resource plan, it could never be easy. A lot of the solar projects also overlay the Trona leasing area that overlay the Trona mines. And so you have this, obviously there's concerns about putting projects over their mines that have subsidence. You've got all of these resource conflict issues out there with the solar. Surprisingly, we had issues with antelope migration with the one that Kimberly processed. So definitely some big learning things that we're going through on the solar projects. You would think would be, people might look at them favorably, but then you've always got this other resource conflict coming in.
This is Elaine. Duane, I had a question for you.
Okay.
How has the reorganization affected Wyoming? Did you get positions, all that? Could you just tell us a little bit how it actually worked out? Sure.
Okay. So we've had some positives from the reorganization, and obviously a few impacts. On the positive side is when they did their table of organization review before moving everybody, we did end up with additional positions that were allocated to Wyoming. Now, 4 of them or 5 of them were encumbered positions, and we inherited the Nebraska wild horse holding facility there. So those positions were encumbered, but on the positive side, we were allocated 6 positions that they went through and said, we're not going to fill these. So here is your allocation to use. I mean, somewhat as you see fit where you need to fill holes in your organization. So on that side, that worked out positively. I didn't think we were going to have very many other impacts, and I was wrong on that front, because we do have folks taking advantage of the new opportunity of getting a headquarters experience without having the lovely experience of living in DC and commuting for multiple hours. So we ended up losing more people than we really thought originally to some of the positions they're advertising. So we kind of gained the 6, but now we've got 5 vacancies that are coming out that people saw some opportunities that were honest with us, saying, I would have never moved to DC. I didn't want to have that commute, but sure, I'll move to Boise, I'll move to Grand Junction, Santa Fe, Salt Lake, etc. So we've had a kind of a mixed bag on that front. It's a great opportunity for some folks to get that Washington experience without having that Washington living experience.
This is Walt George. I have a 2-part question on the pipeline corridor initiative.
Okay.
My first question is, what is the nature of the designation? Is it a plan amendment or a right-of-way grant? And then the second question is, how's the coordination been with the counties when the corridor crosses from public to private lands?
Okay. Walt, it's going to be a resource management plan amendment that designates the corridor. And essentially what we're looking at is reserving a piece of the corridor for the Wyoming Pipeline Corridor Initiative, meaning for carbon dioxide transportation, sequestration uses, etc. As far as the county coordination has been, there's a few challenges on that when you're coming to a corridor designation, and some concerns that where those corridors route. And so I don't want to say it's, we'll say it's been perfect, but no, that would be a bad joke here. So we've had a few concerns in a few places about the corridor designation and potential conflicts between pipelines, overhead power, and things like that. And so that's why we ended up having to do an extension for the plan in order to flesh out the final alternative that our county cooperators were telling us didn't quite explain some of it in depth enough for them to understand what we were doing.
Thank you.
You bet.
Hey, Duane, it's Mary Jo.
Hi, Joe.
Hi. Just a follow-up to what Elaine asked. How has the communication from the Washington office level changed, if you will? Has it been about the same as it used to be? Do you hear less from them? Are you hearing more? Kind of what's the story there?
I think we're starting to hear a little more communication because this is just, I'll throw out my opinion like I want to do here, is that they had a lot of vacancies. So I think you've all probably read the articles that it sounds like maybe 20 to 30% of the folks actually ended up moving and everything there. So we had probably a real lull for over a year with a lot of those positions vacant. So we didn't have a lot of the normal communications. They've had a lot of focus on hiring. And so there have been a lot more meet and greet updates, getting together, et cetera. If nothing else from the COVID, we have all learned to be much more non-traditional once everybody figured out Microsoft Teams, that you can have a video chat and everything. That's increased substantially. So one of the things we definitely are seeing is they had to have some hiring surge teams to come in and help with all of it because they ended up with so many vacancies. They needed to get people hired for it. But we're needing to have a little more communication because we've had such a large amount of staff turnover. I don't want to say nobody knows who's doing what jobs because they're getting those announcements out. But that's one thing that has been clearly identified is we need more frequent updates on who's now in these positions there, because we knew before we've had a real transition over the last 6 to 8, 9 months there where nobody was in the position. Now we need to know they're in a separate place, they're living all over, et cetera. So had increased communication. We're definitely increasing that on with DC on that front. And I guess I'll say my bad joke there is that definitely the 2-hour buffer that probably all of you who were used to is that, it's 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock in DC. It's only, 3 o'clock here, probably not going to hear from them anymore today. That's gone there. So now, it's like, hey, you're hearing from people at 4:30 going, hey, I was not used to hearing from you after 4 o'clock because you were on a 2-hour time difference there. So that has been a difference. And you're saying, well, how did I miss that? Until you realize, oh, well, they're in California. So they're an hour difference there. So shoot, I didn't miss it at 4:30. It just got sent after, I had left and went home at 5 o'clock there, and they send it at 6 o'clock their time. So things like that, that's just been a lesson for everybody to look at.
Okay, any other questions for Duane? Otherwise, it's approaching the 2 o'clock hour here in the East. And with respect to our additional speakers, we probably ought to move a little forward on our agenda. Any other questions right now? We can come back a little bit later, but we probably ought to balance the time.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Duane and Kim. Bill, did you want to take a minute?
Yes, I would.
All right.
Angi Bruce is next, and Angi is the Deputy Director for the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, and her work focuses on external relations. This includes working closely with our state and federal partners, energy developers, and conservation organization. Her work involves oversight of the department's wildlife environmental reviews, including the Sage-grouse executive order policy. In addition, Angi provides the leadership on the migration corridors and works closely with the Department of Transportation in the implementation of the Wyoming's Wildlife and Roadways Initiative. So with that, welcome, Angi.
Great, thank you. It's good to be here. Can you hear me okay? Some nods? Okay. Mary Jo, good to see you, even if it is over Zoom. So yeah, I spend a lot of time working with partners, and I often tell myself that I work with state and federal partners more than I see my own game and fish staff. But it is a fun part of my job. So thank you for having me here today. And I was asked to speak on sage-grouse and migration corridors. Due to time, I'm going to be pretty brief on sage-grouse. I'm going to lean mostly on Bob Budd to cover most of the policy end on that, and I can chime in if needed. But really focus more on migration corridors and giving you a little background and a little status update, if that sounds good. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Are you guys seeing that?
Yep.
All is good? Okay, nice. So just briefly on sage-grouse in Wyoming, I think this trend chart really speaks for itself. But today this year we saw an average of 19.7 males, which is slightly down from last year. You can see was right at 20. So this cyclic pattern, good news, it looks like we're leveling off. I will be extremely surprised if we don't see that bump back up next year. So I'm feeling really good about what we're seeing this year. A little bit of caveat though, COVID intervenes with a lot, as we know. And so we typically monitor about 90% of the occupied leks in the state. And this year, of course, we were down because of COVID. Some of the aerial flights were not able to take place. And so we only were able to monitor about 80%. Still strong numbers, still really good, still pretty much higher than most of the other Western states. However, it did influence a little bit of our data there. So with that, just, really kind of what this means. And there's a couple analysis I like to refer back to. So where we sit today in 2020, we're still 16% above the most recent lows that we saw in 2013. And then an all-time low in 1996, you can see by the graph there, we're still 45% above that. So I bring this up because I don't think there's reason to be alarmed, and we'll continue progressing forward. I did want to mention, though, some other sage-grouse things you might be interested in. If you guys recall, there was a 2017 House bill that directed the Game and Fish Commission to propagate regulation to allow for private bird farms collect sage-grouse eggs in the wild to raise in captivity. And for the last couple years, the one private bird farm that was trying to get permitted through us was unsuccessful. However, this year, their facilities were up to par and we did permit them. With that, they spent almost the entire month of May searching for sage-grouse eggs in the areas that we permitted and had no luck. So at the end of the day, they were unsuccessful in collecting any eggs at all. So that was real brief on sage-grouse. And again, I think we can come back to it at the end, or we could also come back to it during Bob's presentation. But I'm going to jump into migration corridors and where we were at. And, you know, this really thinking about migration corridors, I like to think about them as this link between two distinctive habitats, between their summer and their winter habitat, and the ability to go between. When I'm talking to folks without the background of you guys, I like to often refer to it as maybe the snowbirds who go south for the winter. And it helps me really understand what's going on here. You know, I have an aunt and uncle who go to Florida every year, and they might choose to go at different times, just like mule deer. They don't take off at the same time every year. It's really dependent on the weather. However, when they drive there, they go on the same path every time, just like mule deer. They follow that same path in order to get to their destination. Will they be as healthy if they don't migrate, if they don't go south for the winter? I'd like to say no, because their mood, they would not be in as good of mood. Where mule deer, we know that the ones that migrate are healthier and they lead to better production. So if you think about it in those terms, you can think about how essential this migration is for mule deer in particular. And so, you know, I really get asked by a lot of folks of, you know, why now? Why designating migration corridors at this place in time? And the truth is that our field staff and others, landowners, conservation groups, you guys have known about these migrations for several decades. This picture right here talks about the Jackson Hole elk migration back to the 1950s. I've noticed that in a lot of our records of our staff, they'll have these paper copies of migrations and all the observations that they have noticed over the years. But really what has come to play in the last few years is really the technology has caught up with it. Just like with everything else, we can put GPS collars on mule deer and really figure out where they are moving and when. And this technology has allowed us to model their behavior and come up with these designated corridors. I've had several folks ask me about, well, have you ground truthed this? And my response is, we've known about these for years. The GPS collars that we have now, giving us a point on the landscape every 2 hours, is doing that ground truthing for us. And because we have this new data, we're able to draw these migration corridors to much more precise accuracy. And so what has that meant? In 2016, with this new data and this new information and this new sense of confidence in knowing where these migration corridors are, the commission developed a policy making migration corridor habitat vital in order to sustain the populations of ungulate species. From there, we came up with the ungulate migration corridor strategy. And in that strategy, we were directed, as I'll talk about in a minute, to do what we call biological risk assessments. to address what are the opportunities and challenges with corridors and where we need to focus. So we really saw this kick off in 2016 with these new policies and directions from our commission. And so here is a close-up map. Kimberly and Duane both talked about the Sublette mule deer migration corridor, but I want to point out a few things with this map, and hopefully it's large enough that you can see that within the boundaries, we have different parts of the migration corridor. And the blue here is the high use area. So this is where the majority of the mule deer, this is their pathway. This is where they are moving. And so we put the highest level of protections on this high use area because we know we can make the most impact there. And then also stopover areas. So within that blue part, you can see a lot of those hashed areas. That's where the stopover areas are and where they spend 90% of their time. This is important because if you go back to my aunt and uncle's example, this is really where on their way to Florida, they stop and they refuel. So they stop at their favorite restaurants and get that necessary fuel in order to continue down to Florida or back to Iowa on their way back. So as of today, we have 3 migration corridors designated in Wyoming. The Sublette one, which I just talked about here, and then the Bangs corridor and the Platte Valley corridor. All 3 are mule deer. The Bangs one and the Platte Valley, you will notice, end at the state line, but we all know that they don't end at the state line. That's just where Wyoming has jurisdiction. So we have cut them off there for our purposes. Those 3 are designated right now. We have 2 in draft form, Wyoming range mule deer, and our first pronghorn one, which is the Sublette pronghorn one. And I'll touch base on those, the status of those a little bit at the end of the presentation. So I talked about that assessment that we do. So this assessment involves a variety of things. And all these buckets kind of project everything that goes into this assessment. Really what we're looking at here is our goal is that we want to sustain this corridor into the future. And so we're trying to understand all those impacts on the corridor. Rather it be how much is private land versus state protection, how much of it is in permanent protection, how many conservation projects have been done in that corridor, where do we see need for other improvements, is there a wildlife crossing roadway project that is serving as a bottleneck that we need to focus on. It really analyzes, what we're trying to do is analyze everything that's occurring biologically to impact this migration corridor so we know where to focus efforts moving forward. So what does this mean? We're going to be proactively working with landowners on any conservation practices. We'll be looking at roadway projects, and then we'll also be making recommendations on development to land management agencies, such as the BLM Forest Service, and also with the new executive order to our state permitting agencies as well. So briefly on conservation practices, you know, I got asked a lot by several legislators of the need to designate these corridors. And I learned through that conversation that we weren't doing a very good job of expressing the fact that these corridors are another seasonal habitat, similar to crucial winter range that we've recognized for years. And it really gives us an area to focus on. In the past, maybe we thought entire Western Wyoming was important to work on with habitat projects. And now we have these distinct habitats where we can make sure our efforts go a long way and really have impact. So that some of the things we're focused on, cheatgrass and invasive species management, shrub treatments, aspen management, fence modifications. And this is an example of an overview. This one in particular is the Platte Valley habitat. Platte Valley migration corridor. And it just gives you a sense, if you can see in this map, I know it's really small, but everything that's colored is some sort of habitat treatment or fence conversion. So as you can see, we're just really trying to focus efforts on these migration corridors. And so where are we at with policy? As you guys might know, that when we were reviewing oil and gas leases in the last few years, we often recommended to the BLM to defer those leases that overlapped with the designated migration corridor. That caught a lot of folks' attention. The reason we did that is it was an interim strategy, and we felt until we had something stronger in place that there were some critical leases that we did not want to see developed until we knew more. Because of this, the governor appointed a Migration Corridor Advisory Committee. There were 8 people on this committee that represented industry, the county, landowners, recreation, wildlife. We had one of our county game and fish commissioners on the committee. And the department was not on the committee. I think that's important to note. We provided technical assistance and answered questions along with a lot of other state and federal partners. Duane, Kimberly played a huge role, and we're thankful that they could be at most of the meetings to help with this conversation. This group met 6 different days, and at the end, they developed policy recommendations to the governor and how we move forward with migration corridors in Wyoming. And because of that recommendation, in February of this year, during the legislative session, the governor signed an executive order for mule deer and antelope with migration corridor protections. First of its kind in the nation, this was pretty impressive to see. It is a great example of how Wyoming can come together and find compromise and protect the resource, and at the same time find a way that development can also move forward. Some of the things I wanted to highlight with the executive order, without spending a great deal of time here, is the executive order put any sort of protection of the migration corridor on the state permit. As you recall, my earlier thoughts when we were deferring oil and gas leases on BLM, this is a change. Instead, the protections would fall later on when that oil and gas permit reached out to get their state permit, that oil and gas lease. So that was quite a bit of change. There was a great deal of protection put on those high use areas within the corridor. You know, the science is catching up. We're ahead of most states. I'd like to see more, but we're starting to figure out what level of protection these corridors may need. There's recent work we contracted out that came back to tell us that mule deer can stand up to at least a 3% development in order to sustain migration corridors. Keep in mind that 3% isn't hard and fast. There's a lot of caveats. It depends on terrain. It depends on the landscape, what part of the corridor you're in. But we're starting to get some more science that's going to tell us what is needed for protection here. And until we get that, and as we work forward, the executive order really focuses on looking at individual projects on a case-by-case basis. So we're not going to send a wide sweeping view that no oil and gas leasing can take place, or there can't be any mining or rock quarries in a corridor. We really are looking at it on individual cases, where the project's taking place, what they plan on do, the timing of it, in order to make a recommendation for that state permit. The executive order was really important where it, made a change in identified versus designate. It recognized those 3 corridors I spoke about earlier and said that they were designated in the state of Wyoming. However, it did put a placeholder that talked about the difference between identified or designate. The designated ones were the ones that were at risk from development and should have a higher level of protection on them. I really like this because from day one, I've been talking about, the corridor is the corridor. We know where the animals are moving. There's no denying it. The science is the science. But if we designate one, it almost gives it a higher level. We're doing a threat evaluation and then a risk assessment to decide if that corridor falls into this category. Next, private land versus public. The executive order focuses on any recommendations or restrictions on public land and not private. However, it does encourage private landowners to reach out to Game and Fish and for them to minimize impacts as well. It also lays out a process for designating future corridors. It has several steps where at the end for Game and Fish, if our commission recommends that a corridor be designated to the governor may choose to enact a local working group, and that local working group will review everything in place and then make a recommendation to the governor if they should be designated or not. At the end of the day, the governor will make any future designations in Wyoming. And so those local working groups will play a role in the recommendation of designation, and they also will play a role after the corridor is designated and looking at other things that might need protection, conservation efforts, or work within a corridor. So recommendations on the state permit, like I mentioned, we'll review each project on a case by case. We'll use the best science available to make those recommendations. And at the end of the day, our goal is not to limit development, but rather to limit surface disturbance in the migration corridors. And so where are we now? A couple things have transpired. Again, we have those 2 draft corridors. We're continuing to collect data on other possible corridors. We're deep into finishing up the Platte Valley risk assessment. And the governor is working with Carbon County to enact a local working group for the Platte Valley corridor. And their timeline is October through December that local working group will meet. And then following that, we'll have the bags and the sublet working group, probably sometime in the next, early next year will take place. And then recently, before I wrap up, when this executive order came out, hold on, I'm going to try to, there we go. When this executive order came out during the legislative session, there was a lot of interest, to say the least, on the executive order and if it should be put into law or not. Was an EO the way to go, or should we think about putting it in statute? And there was a lot of folks who thought differently about that subject. Recently, Bob can jump in here, but Bob convened a group just last week, I believe it was, that we had a discussion about where we felt this was and if it was needed in statute at this point. This group involved everywhere from counties to stock growers to several legislators, NGOs, a lot of people with a keen interest in this subject. And at the end of the day, it was in full agreement that everybody believed, let's see how the executive order works. And at this time and place, it is not needed in statute. So I thought that was a really good success on where we are at with this. Okay. So with that, I think I'll open it up to questions and I'll see if I can't get off of shared screen as well.
So Angie, this is Mary Jo, and I just wanted to say thank you. It's a really good presentation. And I really like the way that the state of Wyoming has approached this now. I know that when I was the state director, There was a lot of concern about so many designations that we couldn't possibly keep up with them. But it seems like this is a good compromise in terms of protecting the areas that are important, but doing it in a more measured way, I think. So kudos to everybody involved. I think it's really worked out well.
Angie. Hi, Angie. My name's Jim Ramick. I'm a retired wildlife biologist and occasional land use planner. And you're right, Wyoming has been a leader area, and I certainly said in the last 10 years, I would have killed for the kind of information that's available today when I was involved in the first RMPs and so on with BLM. But I'm curious, where did the bulk of the funding come from, that work that you've done up there? I know I've worked with Hall Sawyer down here in New Mexico, where I helped him find sites and advised him and industry on how to approach gathering the kind of information that's necessary to define these crucial, not just corridors, but crucial habitats. The GIS information just adds so much more than we ever had before. So again, yeah, where did your funding come from?
That is a good question. So a large chunk of that funding has come from our commission. They've been extremely dedicated to this work. And so we invest a great deal every year on it. But with that said, we also have a lot of partners. The Migration Initiative through the university has been very successful in helping us fundraise. The Knobloch Foundation is one of those. The BLM, Duane, you can chime in if I'm wrong, but has helped on numerous collar studies. And then we've also had some in the private sector as well. Let me give you an example. Kimberly mentioned that solar farm that she had their first solar farm in BLM. Did you say in the nation or the state? I can't remember, but that one was partially paid for some collaring work from that private entity that gave us some valuable information. So it's sort of a conglomerate of folks that have paid for it over the years, but there's like you said, a real interest, and it seems to be not that difficult right now to fundraise for this.
One of the things that I found certainly early in my career, coal companies were great to work with in terms of providing funding for work. Oil and gas, much less so until very recently. And my personal opinion is that industry would be much further ahead in their terms of, in their process of looking at areas to lease and potentials for what restrictions might be put on leasing if they sort of pooled together and help fund more of this sort of work elsewhere in other states well, there or in other states that have energy resources that are subject to lease. But again, you guys have done fantastic work up there, and I've always enjoyed reading the papers that have come out of that work.
Hey, Angie, this is Bill. I have one question for you. When you're eradicating your invasive grasses, are you using Esplanade?
We're using a variety of methods. Bob, do you have any knowledge on that? I'm not particular on that particular chemical, if we're allowed to use it or not here.
Yeah, we just, that Dazaflam was just permitted for use on rangelands in July. We have held off on permitting or on funding a lot of those in the spring because we were waiting to see if that would happen. Those have all been funded since then. Prior to that, we were using Plateau. Plateau had variable impacts. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it worked for a year. Sometimes it would carry for 3. But a lot of the field trials on Dazaflam have been done in Wyoming, and those are promising. I think we're still working on other methodologies. We're testing one now that is actually a fertilization as opposed to a chemical attack. We'll have 6 of those plots go in the next week or so. We're doing a number of plots with Bayer on others. But for the most part, right now, we are moving to the Dazzle Flam.
Hey, thanks. It'll be nice to see your, what comes out of it.
Yeah.
Angie, this is Ray Brady. I'm back in Virginia. The House in July passed a Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act, and Senator Udall from New Mexico has introduced a companion bill on the Senate side as well. Are there any provisions in that act that would be a benefit or do something different than what Wyoming's doing?
Oh, that is a really good question. Put me on the spot. Yes, so I'm very aware of those bills. I will tell you that in Wyoming, we would like to keep migration corridors in the process of designating those into the local expertise of the state management authority. And what those bills do is they put that designation into, I believe, the Secretary of Interior that is able to make those designations. And that worries us a little bit because of the efforts that have taken place in Wyoming, that we are so much farther ahead than other states, as you have said, and we have this great collaborative effort going on. When Bob last week can pull a group of constituents together from all entities in wildlife, and we can all agree on where we are with migration corridors, that says something for Wyoming. And if we take that away and then have federal designations, we're just not sure how that's going to work. And so, yes, we're very apprehensive about those bills. Now, what we do like to see, I can follow that up with maybe a more positive note, is the different infrastructure bills, the Senate one being more favorable than the House one, House File 2 and Senate File 2632, I'm not quite sure off the top of my head, Brasso's bill, which provides for wildlife crossing funding for the states. Those were extremely supportive of. The Senate bill would favor Wyoming a lot more, so we're going to be more in favor of it. The House bill tends to follow existing formulas, and due to Wyoming's limited population and funding, we would not benefit as greatly from the House bill.
Yeah, thank you, Angie.
Angie, this is
Walt George. I noticed that the sublet mule deer corridor ends at the interstate highway. Are there any plans to construct overpasses over the interstate to extend the corridor down into southwest Wyoming and possibly northwest Colorado?
Definitely, I would love to see that. It is, those are in our top 40 statewide projects, that area. The problem, as a lot of you know, in southwest Wyoming along there is we don't have an easy identified solution in place. And so it hasn't risen to the top of our projects. And I say that because you have the railroad. We don't want to send the mule deer across the interstate to get blocked by the railroad. So until we have a more viable solution, our focus hasn't been there. But definitely that one is on our radar. It's been identified as a top project, and it'd be something we'd like to see.
Thank you.
Angie, this is Tim Murphy in Idaho. Good day.
Hi there.
Hi. I noticed on your chart for the males attendant on Lex through Wyoming, it's remarkably similar, the trend, Wyoming and Idaho for the last 20 years. I mean, almost point for point every year until 2017. And at that point, Wyoming plateaued, which is not a negative, that's good. And Wyoming and Idaho dropped males attendance on Lex markedly. And that's associated with several years of back-to-back large mega fires, particularly range fires. And much of it cheatgrass driven.
I really applaud you. I saw some of your slides. You're dealing with treatments, pre-emergence, and just keep at it. Fire is just very tough here in Idaho for not only grouse, but the obligate species. And there's just no end in sight. We don't really have treatments that are available now for millions of acres at a time. That's what.
Yep. Yeah, and I might have Bob in his presentation touch on the governor's initiative for invasive species, because it really has, it's been on the department's radar for years. We're stepping up. We've got a lot of things in place, including an extensive mapping exercise, setting our priorities in the state. But the governor's lead on this has been pretty incredible to see. And I'm not going to talk too much about it. Maybe I'll defer to Bob to speak on it during his time. Anything else? Otherwise, I'll just hang out for Bob's, and if there's anything at the end, I can chime in as well.
Okay. Bill, you want to do the honors?
Yeah, I'll do it. Our next speaker is Bob Budd. He's the Executive Director of the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust, a program established to enhance wildlife habitat and natural resource heritage of Wyoming. Prior to this position, Bob was the manager of the Red Creek Ranch and Director of Land Management for the Nature Conservative in Wyoming. And the other thing I'd like to mention about Bob is that he is a past president of the International Society of Range Management and the Wyoming chapter of the Wildlife Society. And with that, introduce Bob Budd.
Thank you very much. It's good to see a lot of you, Tim. Some of you guys, Dawn, I haven't seen in quite a while. And looks like you're weathering the storm. So that's good to see. You gave me about a bunch of topics. I guess if I get to back cleanup, I can do some of these. But initially, I guess what I'd like to talk about is real quick is sage-grouse, kind of where we are with regard to that. I've had a lot of calls lately from the media and others asking about the new administration and the amendments to the plans and everything. And in Wyoming, at least, the plan amendments were pretty docile. We didn't change our focus. And what we did is tried to clarify things that were not made clear enough in the initial plans. And as many of you recall, having worked through that, you're working 90 some plans at the same time. Anybody who thought they were going to come out perfect was smoking crack or something, because there's way too much to do. And so it really didn't change what we did, whether the amendments were accepted or not, but it certainly clarified it. It made it easier for Duane and I to work together, made it easier for the state agencies to interface with the federal agencies. But it didn't, having them adopted or not adopted didn't really change our focus. We've got a cooperative effort. I've been working on this now for 21 years, started in 1999. We have an adaptive management approach to this. As we learn new things and get more information, science feeds us information, we're able to adjust our plans. I think the big thing we have, the advantage that we have in Wyoming, is that we are a dual permitting state. So if we get into a dispute where we may agree at the table, but the rule makers may not, we have the ability to say, we're going to hold your permit, but BLM, Forest Service, also have that authority. So it's given us not only the opportunity to think things through very effectively, but also engage industry and others in our process, as they have been since the beginning. And so we really haven't had a lot of conflict. People have come in, industry's jumped in with both feet and said they don't want to be in the core areas, they don't want to have an impact. That has really, the biggest impact that's had is on the people who are trying to provide mitigation for a fee, because there isn't much mitigation required if there's not any impacts. The thing, and Angie showed you the graph, we're pretty comfortable with where the birds are. They're certainly within the normal range of variability. Our bottom bottoms of our troughs are higher than they've been in the past. If you look back and see where we came from with that ultimate low in 96, we've had two since then. And each time we seem to get a little bit higher on the low end, which tells you that we're abating some of the threats. The big thing we had to do initially, obviously, was stop the bleeding and get a handle on where our birds were and what they needed, and we feel good about that. We've actually added now hundreds of thousands of acres back into habitat. We're seeing some transition that's going to be interesting to watch in northeast Wyoming as the coal bed methane activity has been pulled out, and our Oil and Gas Commission has an accelerated orphan well program, plugging and abandoning. They've actually expanded that from downhole to surface, and we're seeing some indication that birds are reoccupying areas that they had avoided during the height of that boom. That's one we're going to keep track of, keep an eye on. It's kind of interesting. We've done this now through, or at least I have, through 4 presidents, 3 governors, and the process has not changed. We've been able to navigate those waters and do it effectively. And while there's a lot of external hoopla and hollering, really, I don't think that much has changed. Don, if we go back to when we started on this, Mary Jo's tenure and Duane today, really not much has changed in our approach. So I think it's a good place. It ended up being, I think, a bit of a catalyst for what we did on migration. Very similar process, making sure everybody had a seat at the table. And as Angie told you, I think the culmination of that effort was outstanding in that we had a group pretty much hair on fire during the legislative session about this needed to be done by the legislature, and the governor couldn't designate, and on and on. We convened that group. We had 2 senators, 2 House members, a representative from each of the major entities, oil and gas, mining, agriculture, environmental organizations, conservation groups. Meeting took us 2 hours, and at the end of the day, it was unanimous that we don't need to do anything more, that the executive order process is working. So we've gained some experience through this process. Challenges as they relate to sage-grouse, the big one is invasive species, and Tim mentioned that as it relates to Idaho. It doesn't matter, Oregon, Nevada, all the states, that's an issue. We're hopeful that the indaziflam is going to be something that we can use. The governor did appoint again, and I sat on that, the invasive species group, and tomorrow we will actually finalize our report back to the governor. It's been really well done. Probably, I think it's about 70 pages right now, but very similar to what we did with sage-grouse in 1999-2000. Analyzed every aspect of this, what chemicals work, what don't, what does fire do, what does it doesn't, what do you need to do relative to prevention, relative to fire rehab. Each of those is a section in the recommendations to the governor, ultimately culminating in recommendations for funding and maintaining some kind of a program that isn't just a hit or miss or random acts of conservation. One area that I will mention that I think that in talking with Leslie Schreiber, our state sage-grouse lead, that we share a not a concern, but maybe a curiosity, and that is, what about the unknown perils that we've not thought we had to deal with? And that would be things like parasites. I know from reading Patterson's book that was a potential issue back in the 40s and 50s. That disease, are there disease vectors that we haven't thought about? Are there things that we've kind of dismissed in the past? Predation, hunting, all of those, that could become additive at some point. And for those of you who with a range background, I'm more and more in these conversations throwing out the idea that population biology and habitat ecology really probably have a commonality if we start looking at things like stable states and thresholds. I believe there are points in populations where you will cross that threshold And getting back across that becomes incredibly difficult, just as it does in rangeland ecosystems. You know, if you cross out of a bunch grass system into a rhizomatous, it changes what you can do and how you can do it. And I think we're seeing that in some areas with bird populations. So those are things that I think we're looking at. The final one that I think is perhaps the most vexing challenge that we have is maintaining the commitment. And people get weary of these things. You know, it's like, when does it go away? And my answer is, this one isn't going to go away. We have got to keep the hammer down on it. It's too risky if you look at the risk of fire. We've had a couple fires here, nothing on a parallel with our states to the west of us, but it still is an issue, because if we lose those really valuable habitats, we're going in the wrong direction. So that's a quick update on sage-grouse, and perhaps on the invasive species front. The questions have been raised about the federal funding, and we're trying on a number of fronts to attack that. Angie gave you a good explanation of some of the frustration we have with the formulaic approach that's based on population as opposed to acres of habitat. That really penalizes states like Wyoming, overly penalizes us, because we've got probably as much per cap, well, we've got more per capita habitat than probably everybody but Alaska. And yet, and it's in good shape, but our population doesn't dictate that we would, you know, the last time around, I think we got about a tenth of what Chesapeake Bay did. So it puts it in perspective. We are working with BLM. Duane, we started that during the legislative session to actually transfer and hold money from the federal agencies through the Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust. We do not, our money doesn't revert. We can set up sub-accounts, and we are doing that. We're hopeful that we're going to see 2 of those come through in the next month. One would be with Fish and Wildlife, the other with BLM. That BLM money would be strictly dedicated to funding WLCI, the Wyoming Landscape Conservation Initiative that Don Simpson asked about earlier. We match it, and it also, the legislature matches it into the corpus of our trust account. So we think we have a good mechanism to do it. As you can imagine, the agreement between Fish is different than the one with BLM, which is vastly different than Forest Service, which is different than NRCS. And so we're also working through the governor's office now on what I think we're calling an umbrella agreement that would be a way for the state of Wyoming, through whatever entity, whether it's Angi shop, mine, forestry, or whoever, to cooperatively fund some of these long-term landscape scale projects. And we're hopeful that one of those that will be a pilot for that, WLCI being one that exists, but the Lava project with the Forest Service in eastern Wyoming is another one that's on tap that we're looking at. Segue into migration real quickly. That's where that has really panned out. We've got now nearly $600,000 in private funds that have been dedicated into the corpus of the trust program. That money we've matched 1-for-1, so we've generated 1.2 million now for crossings. And there are 2 that are on the table. One is Dry Piney, a big project over in western Wyoming. Angie, you can tell them, but I think when they initially queued this up, they thought they might be able to do 4 out of 14 underpasses and fence and associated fencing. We're now looking at completing the entire project, hopefully in the coming year. That'd be, I think, 14 underpasses, fencing, or maybe it's 14 miles. And it'll be about a $20 million project. And that was bumped a lot by the work that Senator Barrasso did to get federal highway funds in there. But we've also got contributions from a variety of private sources and then from the state. The legislature did allocate $3 million for crossings in the last session. And right now I have half of that is already matched. I think by the end of this month, we'll have the entirety of that 3 million dedicated. Some of that will go to Dry Piney in western Wyoming. The majority of it, it appears, is going to go to a KC to Buffalo crossing project. It looks like it's going to cost about 2 million. They were thinking that was maybe 4 or 5 years off. Right now, it looks like we'll have that project done in a year. So we've got a lot of good things going on in spite of COVID, in spite of what our economy has taken, the beating we're taking here in Wyoming. But all in all, I would tell you that I think where we are relative to wildlife habitat, relative to the key issues of the day is similar to what Angie said. We have been able to get ahead of it, at least to some degree. We've funded through the trust a ton of research on migration movement and habitat use, particularly by mule deer, but also by elk and antelope. We've got 24 projects on our docket. We just closed our period the first of the month, and we have 24 projects. About half of those are related to migration. There's fence modification projects and a variety of others, but also crossing projects. And so I think that if you're wildlife, Wyoming's a pretty good place to be, COVID or no COVID. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have or go into other areas if you'd like me to. But that's kind of where we're at. I'll give Angie a chance to chime in if I missed anything.
No, Bob, I think you said good. And that Dry Piney project will be 8 underpasses, but yeah, right about 20 million. So.
Hey, Bob, Don Simpson, good to see you.
You too.
Thanks for the conversation. Hey, a quick question. Do you see yourself having a advisory group similar to what you have with Sage-grouse for the corridors, or will you do them corridor by corridor?
Yeah, Don, that's a good question. I think that we, and you were a part of this, we really hit a home run with Sage-grouse in the way that we approached it. It was kind of new and people came back from it saying, hey, this works. That doesn't mean you need to do it for everything. And I think Angie will bear me out on this. Anything that comes up now, they go, oh, we need a SIGIT for this or that. No, we don't. That process was a completely different thing. A lot of what we learned from that was that you've got to have input and you've got to have transparency. And so the process that's envisioned with migration is more about transparency, taking your time, not getting in a hurry. The local working groups will have a huge amount of input and say in that, as they should, and as they did with Sage-grouse. But you don't need an overarching group at the state level to put another level of bureaucracy or another time constraint on. So we're not looking at doing that with migration. I think we've got a great process between the public, the department, the commission, and ultimately the governor. And certainly the governor is going to rely on his advisors as he needs to make those decisions. But I don't think we'll have nearly the formal process that we've had with Sage-grouse on that, and probably not. We did a similar process on the invasive species, but that will not lead to a invasive species group. We've got those in place. What it did is identified where you had overlap, where you had duplication, and hopefully will help us be more efficient, more effective in that regard.
Thanks, Bob.
Any other questions? Any other questions for any of our speakers? Okay, hold on a minute. I want to thank everybody for watching on YouTube today. This will conclude our YouTube simulcast.
Thank you all.